Hey everyone, I am here with Allan Sloan, who is a business journalist and columnist at the Washington Post. How are you today, Allan?
I'm fine, Emma. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was fascinated by your piece because I think you laid it out so well. Allan wrote a very fascinating piece in both the Washington Post and it was cross published in ProPublica. Donald Trump built a national debt so big, even before the pandemic, that it will weigh down the economy for years. Now, I want to start first with the hypocrisy angle because, of course, the GOP, that's my favorite, right? Of course, the GOP constantly talks about debt and deficit, debt and deficit, debt and deficit. And then they're open about how they're going to bring it up, but or they only bring it up, I guess, when there's a Democratic president. But the Tea Party was a movement predicated on reducing the national debt, reducing the deficit, and Trump ballooned it to these levels. I mean, you wrote about these figures in your piece. National debt rose by $7.8 trillion during his time in office. It's the third biggest deficit increase of any president. And the deficit outscored the Congressional Budget Office projections. I believe they thought 2018 and 2019 would be 2 and 3% of GDP, but both of those were over 4% of the GDP. Just a preview of what you wrote about. Can you talk about the disconnect there and just also lay out the ways Trump broke records on the debt and deficit in your piece?
Sure.
Yeah.
Also, just so you'll know, I had a partner on this, a fellow named Cesare Podkul, whom I've worked with for a while in any number of places and at ProPublica. What happened with Trump, whom I've written about for 30 years, and he hasn't changed any, except he's gotten a little heavier and he's now a former president. He his great talent is telling people what they want to hear. So he goes on and he carries on in 2016, I guess it was, telling my Washington Post colleagues, I'm going to pay off the debt. I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm allowed to talk this way because he's from Queens.
Yeah.
I'm going to pay off the debt in 8 years. Then, he keeps talking about all the great progress he's making, and none of it is true because when you have a big tax cut, the way they did, and they promised the tax cut would pay for itself and it would give average people a $4,000 a year increase in their salary. And of course, none of that happened. And meanwhile, Social Security, which by the way, I'm collecting, and Medicare, which I'm also collecting, is growing. The defense budget is growing. The revenues are down. And suddenly the Democrats are talking about they're worried about deficits. But I just wanted to look at all of these numbers and see what was going on. And Cesare and I worked on this together, and we were just shocked by what we found of how big it was and how many warnings there were, including warnings from Trump's own people before the virus set in, saying, we got to do something. And he never did anything. And then the whole thing blew up.
Well, I mean, you touched on some incredibly important points there. One, you being familiar with Trump's past work is key because anybody who is familiar with his business dealings might understand that he wasn't exactly penny pinching or smart with his money. I mean, he's been bankrupt multiple times. So we can talk about his personal life and his personal business dealings and how maybe that informed this. Even though I would say it's a broader Republican problem. I mean, they completely obfuscate and uh, they lie to the public about what their priorities are. They use the debt and deficit as a cudgel for Democrats when there's a Democratic president in office, and then both Bush and Trump ballooned the debt and deficit. Um, but but also, I mean, you talk about the tax cuts. People really do forget that Trump cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Can you talk about one Trump and your understandings about his uh, relationship with money based on studying him for 30 years, and also the effect of the corporate tax rate on the debt and
Oh,
deficit in
okay.
general?
Now I ran into
Very
Trump
broad.
a long time ago, back when I was a newspaper reporter. for something called New York Newsday of blessed memory because it's gone out of business. Newsday hasn't, but New York Newsday is gone. And I'm the kind of person who actually reads numbers and reads financial statements and sort of understands them. And I'm looking at what this guy is talking about, and I'm looking at what the numbers say, and you sort of can't get from here to there. And he and I had a number of conversations, some of them obscene, which I can't repeat here, because again, he's from Queens and he has an accent. I'm from Brooklyn. I have an accent. And the longer he and I talk to each other, the heavier our accents got because we're excited. We're waving our hands and we're doing all the things that you do. And, I just couldn't stand him. And to the extent he knew about me, he couldn't stand me. So the last thing on earth I expected was to see him as president. Also, I happen to live in New Jersey, where he ended up bankrupting. He had 5 bankruptcies in New Jersey. He had 3 casinos, all of which went bankrupt. And then the casinos became companies, and the companies went bankrupt. So we had 5 bankruptcies in New Jersey, 1 bankruptcy with the Plaza Hotel in New York, and 1 million, foreclosures and forced sales. And he was, I think, a complete financial disaster. And then he ended up on television, and I think that's what made him. And that's what introduced him to, we'll call it, the rest of America, and made him look successful and made him look like this and made him look like that. And he really is good at telling an audience what interests an audience and what it wants to hear. That's his major talent. And then one day I wake up and he's president. I'm saying, how can this be? And the joke I wanted to do, but nobody laughed, was a corporate bankruptcy is called Chapter 11. So on Wall Street, if a company's going bankrupt, it's a 22, right? 2 times 11. So I wanted to call him Donald 66 Trump because he had 6 bankruptcies, but nobody thought that was funny. So I never got to do
Hey,
it.
no, I liked it. I liked
Well,
it.
that's fine. But Emma, you weren't my editor, and it's too late now. He's
Too
gone.
late. Right. Well,
And now with the corporate tax thing, at the risk of making you angry, but then again, what can you do to me? The corporate tax rate of 35% was very high compared to the tax rates in other countries. So US companies are doing all these weird things that I used to write about, of pretending to be, a British company, pretending to be a Dutch, going through all of these contortions. And the idea of cutting the rate from 35% to where I suspect the Biden people are going to try to put it, 28 or 29%, that would have been competitive. But instead it went to 21. Now, this worked out great for me because my wife and I have been very lucky. We own a lot of stock relative to, where we come from, and stock went up. So we made a lot of money, but it was a terrible thing for the country. And it really left a big hole in the budget, and no one ever did anything about it. And by the way, the Democrats are about to start doing the opposite. The Republicans care, they say tax cuts pay for themselves. The Democrats are about to say public spending pays for itself. I mean, who knows? But Trump, Biden didn't run promising to pay off the debt. Biden didn't run as a supposed financial genius. Biden never did what Trump did in October, for God's sakes. And he says, we're just about to start paying off the debt in a public meeting. He just makes it up and says it, and it isn't true. So Cesare and I went out and got the numbers, and we just wrote the numbers, and the numbers speak pretty powerfully, I think.
they do. I mean, they're one, I will say, it's one thing if you were gonna cut the corporate tax rate and also fill in those loopholes that allow these companies to offshore and to circumvent a lot of the United States tax law. I mean, Amazon infamously has paid $0 in taxes, or that's kind of the colloquial saying about it. So I think that's a more reasonable position. Trump was just trying to create some sort of economic sugar high in order to benefit himself, regardless of the long-term consequences to the economy. That's my read on things. Um,
And I hate to say it, but that's also my read on things.
okay.
I
Well,
mean,
there
we agree. Is that bad? That's probably bad, but
No, it's a good thing.
oh,
It's,
is it? Okay.
I try to seek harmony, and understanding, and I like talking to people who have expertise in certain issues because it's not necessarily the things that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, as a lefty and as a talk show host, basically, co-host. But the other thing I want to touch on is the role of the debt and deficit. So you're pretty adamant that it's going to present a lot of problems. There are some MMT theorists out there that believe that it's
Sorry.
less. Oh, you're laugh. So
Uh,
so 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 why laugh about MMT?
oh,
I think that it's a hot
it,
button issue with a lot of people on the left, people who want to increase government spending, and I think you would agree in your piece, as you did, that an injection of government funds into the economy right now is necessary. Um, what's your perspective on that, and how that relates to Trump and his handling of the debt and deficit?
all right. First of all, I can't help it. MMT, I wrote a column about that, I guess about 2 years ago, enraging people. MMT stands for modern monetary theory. And to summarize it, it means as long as you can borrow, in a currency, as long as a country can borrow in a currency that it can print, the deficit doesn't make any difference. I called MMT the magic money theory because money falls from the sky and it's wonderful and it's just great and there isn't any problem. And my problem, I agree now, and I'm probably about to write a column saying even though I'm no fan of Trump and I don't like debt very much, clearly we have to spend now to get the economy out of the rut. We have to. And that's how it is. But at some point we need to at least have some form of rationality. But MMT is wonderful. I used to call it. Do you remember what the Laffer curve is? No,
Vaguely, yes.
that was this right wing fantasy and created by a guy named Arthur Laffer, who I think Trump gave some medal to a few weeks ago or something. That basically tax cuts pay for themselves. So you can't. It's not possible to cut taxes too much because the more you cut it, the more money you make. I mean, which is absurd, but it sounded good and had a lot of happy equations in it. I used to call MMT the lefties' Laffer curve because I'm not a fan of anybody. I'm a congenital skeptic. I look at the numbers, I try to figure it out. I'm what I call a recovering English major. I majored in English at Brooklyn College. I learned I became a business writer by accident, but I'm reasonably good with numbers, and I learned and I talk to people and I listen. So, I have this sort of practical knowledge. I'm not real good at theory, but I'm pretty good at figuring stuff out. And the modern monetary theory just makes me laugh. The Laffer curve makes me laugh. Trump makes me laugh. I've got a weird sense of humor.
Well,
So, I mean,
yeah.
that's where I am.
But can you explain, like, what I think I take in terms of kernels from MMT, and not to get too off topic here, is just I think the role of inflation in what is propagated by a lot of more establishment folks in the United States government is generally overblown, and a lot of times an excuse to hamper the Fed and push for more austerity measures. Would that be your
Well,
assessment?
again, I'll
If we,
shock you because even though I'm not a lefty, I think, all right, the idea of inflation is a problem, or it can be, but you have to worry about it when you have it. You can't sit and run your life around inflation, especially when what you do is you start with your conclusions and work backwards to your assumptions, which is what a lot of political economics is. You have to invent a reason that you're afraid of inflation. So you say, gee, it's excessive spending. Tax cuts, of course, and deficits don't increase inflation. It's always spending. It's all just absurd. But again, since I'm not big on theory, I'm big on application. But at the end of the day, my numbers add up across and down. And, I never did get a PhD in anything. So, clearly I can't be informed.
Well, no, I mean, you've got a good New York, New Jersey sense of humor. I always appreciate that in a guest coming from the area myself. Um, I saw you wrote another piece in the Washington Post that I wanted to touch on because it does tie into the Trump administration's relationship with the economy. Um, how divorced the markets were in 2020. I mean, they've been divorced for quite a while, I would say, from regular application of the economy to regular people's lives. But it really was obscene this year, the way that the Trump administration sort of semi-socialized the markets and injected a ton of money into them. And there was, in some instances, extremely profitable performance, while there was poverty and unemployment and mass hurt. Can you talk about that in relationship to the Trump administration?
Sure, I was one of the first people to actually pick up on this because the difference between what was going on in the stock market and what was going on in the real world was just shocking to me. I mean, not shocking, outraged, because I try not to be outraged, but the difference was just astonishing. And again, it's not the Trump a lot of it is the Federal Reserve, which is doing, I think, rightly what it thinks it needs to do, which is to compensate for the disastrous economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. I mean, printing money doesn't save lives, but at least it helps the economy. And the Fed felt that since the rest of the government wasn't functioning really well to help, that they would hold down interest rates and do what they can do. But the Fed can help markets. It can help financial institutions. It can't send checks to individual people or support state and local governments, which I think should have been done. So you had this crazy thing where here's the Fed helping, doing what it can do, and that helped run the market up, which again made a lot of money by my standards for me. But I was looking at it and saying, well, I'm not giving the money back, but this is crazy because people like me, or actually way above me on the food chain, are making out like mad, and the people who don't own a lot of stocks, which is most people, are not getting anything. I mean, and Trump, for whatever crazy reason, you remember, used to judge himself by the stock market.
Well, it's obscene. I mean, but that's what he cared about. He I can't believe we're talking about him in the past
Well,
tense,
he's
but
gone. He
um
is
I
gone.
know. I know. But he seemed to only care about wealthy people and their enrichment despite running on something like drain the
Yeah,
swamp.
well, I can't disagree with that. And the funny thing is, the day he left office, January 20th, the stock market was way up. So, if you could say, well, gee, he loved the stock market, but then he left and the stock market just went way up. It's highly amusing if you care about the stock market and that's how you judge yourself, which is what he did.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And lastly, just on that point, how can, with an increased amount of Americans and younger people, my generation, are less likely to invest, to participate in the stock market, and I think that increases the stratification of wealth, and also just the fact that what the economy that my generation experiences is entirely different from the economy of older generations who are more likely to be participating in the stock market. Um, can you talk about how that divide can be bridged going forward and potentially in a Biden
Well, all right.
administration?
First of all, again, at the risk of making you angry, but as I said before,
I'm not angry. I'm cool
I'm
as a
going to disagree
cucumber.
with you. It is not hard to invest in stocks. You may not have any money, but when I was starting out, when I was your age, and I'm not even going to tell you how long ago that was, you had to have a stockbroker. you normally had to buy at least 100 shares. My wife and I started, we didn't have any money. We didn't inherit anything. Um, but we got lucky and we found a broker who was helpful. But today, I mean, you can go out and for a relatively small amount of money, you can buy something called an index fund, which did not exist when I was your age, and put maybe $1,000 or $2,000 into the market. You can buy
Well, I
stocks.
mean, most people our age don't even have, or half of American families wouldn't have
Well,
$500 in an emergency. So,
I understand that, but some of them do. I'm saying you can do it modestly. I'm not sitting in judgment of people who don't have money because I know what it's like not to have money, and it's scary and it's awful, and to have no prospect of money is even scarier. It's frightening, but um, the Biden people, they've got, I think, a lot of the right ideas. I think from what I understand of their stimulus package, most of it makes a lot of sense. Helping governments makes sense. One of the things they can do, and I would do if I were them, would be I would cut the interest rates on student loans to 1% or something like that. There are a lot of things they can do to help people who are young and struggling and give them a chance to breathe and get ahead. That's what they have to do. I I didn't like class warfare under Trump, even though in theory I'm in the winning class. But you don't do that in this country. What Biden said in his inauguration speech, which I hope you listened to, is we all need to listen to each other. We need to try to work together. Let's just try to make this work. Let's be prudent. Let's be decent. Let's listen to each other. And a lot of these problems may solve themselves if we can bring ourselves to do that. And I don't mean you and me, I mean society can bring itself to do it, despite all the hatreds and bigotry and meanness on all sides that now exists. I'm a congenital optimist. I'm 76 years old, but I intend to be around to plague my children for at least another 30, 40, 50 years.
well, I look forward to that.
Okay.
Allan Sloan, columnist at the Washington Post, and you've been an economics reporter for a long time, or a business journalist, I should say. So, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have your perspective.
My pleasure, Emma. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.